Mr. Yeshitela, I told you that the concept of the times in the South is different than in another parts of the world. Chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, founder of the Barn and Spear newspaper, which has published continuously since the 16th. Author of the powerful new book, One Africa, One Nation, 40 years of bold leadership and unwavering commitment to the struggle for the self-determination of the African community. Formerly known as Joseph Waller, the very young leader of the junta of militant organizations in the 1960s, Omali Yeshitela is today a veteran in the struggle for African freedom, giving continuity and experience. Chairman Omali Yeshitela has built the African People's Socialist Parties, founded in 1972, to complete the Black Revolution. Since that time, the African People's Socialist Party has established Uhuru House, Black community organizing centers around the country, founded the National People's Democratic Uhuru Movement to defend the democratic rights of the African community, and built economic institutions controlled by and benefiting the African working class, such as Uhuru Black Gym of our own in St. Petersburg, Florida, the African People's Socialist Party's national headquarters. Today, he is in Huelva with us. He has told me that this is their first visit in Spain, not only in Huelva, only in Spain, for contributing to our scientific works, but mainly for collaborating to our better understanding on Africa. Wherever you heard the word, thank you very much for coming.
I would like to thank you very much for the introduction, and also to offer my profound thanks and appreciation to the organizers of this Congress. I would also like to express my appreciation to the other presenters for this Congress, and to all of you for coming out to share your time with us during this very significant event for the next few days. First of all, I would like to say that coming from the United States, I feel that it is absolutely necessary that I express my absolute condemnation of the U.S. aggression, occupation, new colonization of Iraq and Afghanistan. I do not think it would be appropriate for me, leaving the United States, to come and speak to such an august body without publicly expressing the fact that there are a number of us who live in the United States who are opposed to colonialism, however it looks, in whatever period of time it exists. So I want to say that first of all. Secondly, I would like to say that my esteemed comrade here, when we first met, asked me the question of whether I am aware of the roots of my family in Africa. My answer is no. And beyond that, I told him that I am not curious as to where my family comes from in Africa. And the reason I am not curious of where my family comes from in Africa is because Africa today, trapped in artificial borders created by imperialism in 1884 and 85, is too involved now with ethnic politics and politics based on some assumption to a relationship to an artificial nation which in most instances did not exist before the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85. I am an African. That is good enough for me. I am one who understands that although I live in the United States of America, that it would be impossible for an African to get on a ship in Africa as an African to arrive in America and become something else. If I was an African when I got on the ship in Africa, I had to be an African when I got off the ship in America. So we were Africans then, we're Africans now. And that is the perspective that I come from. And I want to also say to you that my perspective is informed by philosophy, by an ideology. I do not pretend to speak to you as though we do not live in a very real world, and where the conditions that we are talking about in Africa are not conditions that simply occurred, but they are conditions which have been imposed on Africa. And so I hope that those of you who have come out to this Congress are able to really think of Africa in new ways. I'm hoping that people who have come here did not come with the anticipation of being able to express more pity for Africa. It is my hope that you will become outraged, if you are not already outraged, by the relationship that Africa has to Europe, North America. I am politically influenced by philosophies of people like Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Robert Mangalisisa Sobukwe, and Malcolm X. These are some of my ideological parents. I am someone who speaks to you as a social worker. I am a revolutionary. I am convinced that Europe, North America do not have the ability to do right by Africa, but it is the responsibility of Africans, ourselves, to organize to overturn the relationship that we have with Europe and with North America. Unfortunately, the last 500 years of history has been a history of imperialism. We wake up today in the 21st century and look out upon a world which gives the impression of having always been like this. But it has not always been like this. The fact of the matter is that Africa is the richest continent on earth in terms of natural resources. 12 million square miles. When you count the islands of natural resources, of tremendous wealth, a place where billions of dollars every year are taken from Sierra Leone as an example, in the form of diamonds on the one hand. But on the other hand, where the African workers who bring those diamonds to the surface, for Europe, for North America especially, are expected to live off 30 cents a day, and if they're lucky, a cup of rice. Africa is not poor. Africa is being looted. We talk about an Africa where each of us who has a cell phone or I think they're referred to as mobiles here in Europe, has an instrument that requires for its workings a strategic mineral known as coltan. 87% of the world's coltan is located in what is now referred to as Democratic Republic of Congo. Since 1998, from 5 to 7 million African people have died in Congo as a consequence of proxy wars, being fought, among other things, for those resources. Africa is not poor. Africa is being looted. Not only looted of natural resources, but human resources as well. And this is something that has been going on for a very long time. So I'm hoping that this Congress will be able to look at the question of Africa, its relationship to the North, if you will, not through pitying eyes, but through eyes of outrage. I'm hoping that this Congress, at minimum, will bring people to a different consciousness about the relationship that Africa has to the world, and perhaps allow us to come to some different conclusions about what it is that we can do to change this relationship. I come from the United States, where oftentimes this country is referred to as a nation of immigrants. Perhaps you have heard of the United States being referred to as a nation of immigrants. It is a concept that we disagree with. We don't see the United States as being a nation of immigrants. Rather, we see it as a prison of nations, an entity that was founded as a consequence of an aggression that was made against the indigenous population there, who are called Indians now. The majority of the survivors are currently living in concentration camps that are known as reservations, where they have a lifespan in the 40s. They talk about the United States being a nation of immigrants, but I would tell you that African people who are in the United States did not come as immigrants. We came as captives. And our conditions of existence in the United States are conditions which stem from the relationship that the United States and Europe have with Africa. When we look at the conditions, when we look at Katrina, and I think many of you are familiar with the Hurricane Katrina and the consequences, the United States response that sent military troops in to cordon off the African people after having allowed Africans to die unnecessarily in that. When we look at the Katrina, it's like looking at any other situation on the continent of Africa itself. Because the conditions of Africans in the United States is an extension of the conditions of Africa itself. That our relationship to imperialism is the same in the United States as it is in Africa. I should have said to you that it is impossible for an African in the United States to be an African American, as we are sometimes called. To be an African American is an African American, we believe, is the same as saying that someone is a slave and a slave master at the same time. It is impossible to be both a slave and a slave master. America built itself at the expense of Africa. And so we say that we are not African Americans, we are Africans. And we are Africans regardless of whether or not many of our people understand our historical relationship with Africa. Because the reality is that most of us have got our education in the United States, in Africa itself, from the colonizer who is responsible for our conditions. So we got the same education as you got. And when we were taught in schools, we were taught that slavery was something wonderful. In fact, even now, the president of France talks about how Africa has never brought any contribution to the world, that it is quite uncivilized. And the British and the French talk now about having to introduce into schools the benefits of colonialism, the goodness, the good things that colonialism did. My friends, the reality is this, that when Africans met Europe, it was not Africa who was poor, it was Europe that was poor. When Africans met Europe, it was not Africans who were unhealthy, it was Europe that was unhealthy. The reality is that when we met Europe, Europe lived during an era of feudalism. There was no freedom for Europeans. This concept of Europe visiting the rest of the world to bring us freedom and democracy, there was no freedom or democracy in Europe. When we met Europe, feudalism existed and the reign of the kings and queens and nobility. It was during a time when kings would actually tell free men to shut up. Not the 21st century where free men tell kings to shut up, right? When we met Europe, this was the reality. This was the reality. When we met Europe, was no such thing as ordinary Europeans owning your own homes, etc. This thing that we say, there's a saying in the United States that a man's home is his castle. No, the castle was the place where the nobility resided when we met Europe. The fact of the matter is, between the 4 short years of 1347 and 1351, half the people in Europe died of plague. And for the next 100 years or more, Europe still suffered the consequence of that and several other plagues. You cannot lose half your population in 4 years and have a viable economic life. It was a poor and impoverished Europe that rescued itself from poverty and disease by the invasion of the rest of the world. We are told that, and I was taught this when I went to school, that Europeans came to Africa and came to the Americas to export Christianity and civilization. They had an abundance of such in the United States. And this is why. But the reality is that Europe was impoverished and diseased. And if it had anything to export, it was poverty and disease. But Europe, with a vengeance, attacked the rest of the world. It attacked not only Africa, although we must talk about Africa because the conditions that we see confronting Africa today have their origin in history. It is not something that just materialized, as we are told, with corrupt leaders in Africa, etc. The corruption started a long time ago, and it was not in Africa. But we are talking about the wealth of an impoverished place, the development of an impoverished Europe, a place where up until the 17th century did not exist as a concept. We're talking about Europe as a concept, which achieved its identity as a concept through the process of slavery and colonialism. Prior to slavery and colonialism, Europeans identified themselves or defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other. It was only as a consequence of slavery, colonialism, the competing drive to capture human beings and the resources from around the world, that Europe increasingly began to define itself not primarily in relationship to each other, but primarily in relationship to the rest of us, Africans and the rest of us. It was a process which saw the entire ecosystem of the Atlantic, the ecological system of the Atlantic Ocean changed as a consequence of attack on Africa and African people being shipped across the Atlantic. Thousands and millions of whom would die in the process. Some thrown overboard, some refusing to go willingly and leaping overboard, some throwing their children overboard rather than see them go into slavery. Millions died. And the sharks, actually learned to follow those ships from Africa across the Atlantic. Schools of sharks would follow the ships that had Africans who we call slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. There is an umbilical cord connecting African people in the Americas and Africa, made of the skeletons crossing the Atlantic, a highway of bones of African people crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That is our connection. And that is something that I think is fundamentally important for us to understand when we look at where we are today, that it has its origin some time ago in the history of this relationship. And so we're talking about an aggression against China, 1841-42, the so-called Opium War that turned China itself into a nation of drug addicts for the benefit of England, which was a participant in the development of the entire economy of Europe. We're talking about France, which in addition to what it was doing in Africa, held Vietnam as a colony, where for 100 years or more, most of the colonial resources coming from Vietnam to France was in the form of opium, drugs. There were at least 3,000 legal opium dens in France and in Vietnam under French colonialism. We're talking about Portugal, which by 1500 had brought out this is Portugal alone, which by 1500 had brought out some 700 tons of gold from Africa. These are resources that went to developing Europe, a Europe that was impoverished, a Europe that was diseased, and a Europe that was unfree when we first came into contact with it. Where does the wealth come from that we are now treated as beggars throughout the world? Despite the fact that today Africa is so wealthy in terms of natural resources, we are treated as beggars across the world. We are in Spain as illegals. We are in England and France as illegals. There's a saying among Africans. We say, we are here because you were there. And that is the reality that we have to deal with. And so I think it's necessary for us to talk about this, because both Africans and non-Africans live under some kind of illusion about this relationship, that somehow getting to America, getting to someplace in Europe is our salvation. When we are in Africa, that is how we feel. And then those Europeans and North Americans often feel also that somehow we are intruding on Europe and North America by being here, and somehow impacting upon the resources that ought naturally go to Europe and North America. But the truth of the matter is, when I walk down the streets in Amsterdam, and I see the incredible architecture and the obvious wealth, the magnificent social system that takes care of their elderly, gives them tremendous amounts of resources after they can no longer work. When I look at that, and I have to recognize the fact that Holland built itself of slavery, that the first Africans who came to North America came in slave ships from Holland, that Holland took so many resources from what we now refer to as South Africa. And the fact is that Holland is not alone in this relationship to Africa. And not only did these things happen, But on the backs of this, we saw of the slavery and colonialism, we see the emergence of the Industrial Revolution that changed all of Europe. Where when we met Europeans, the vast majority of the Europeans lived as serfs, tied to the land in a feudal system, not like slaves, but the next closest things to slaves. They couldn't be sold as Africans were later sold, but if the land was sold, they went with the land, tied to the land in that fashion, without freedom. And now we have the emergence of all these resources coming from Africa and from the rest of the world that begins to transform European society. I'm told and was taught through my education, which was a colonial education in the United States, that European democracy and development occurred as a consequence of some really important ideas that Europeans had, Descartes, Rousseau, people like this, and they wrote incredibly significant things about democracy, and this is the thing that led to the bourgeois or democratic revolutions of Europe. But I really suspect that one of the things that had something to do with transformation in Europe was all of the resources that were now coming into Europe, and resources that actually challenged the nobility throughout Europe, challenged feudalism throughout Europe, so that you have these new entrepreneurs. Some of them were pirates. Some of them were adventurers who were able to get money from the queen to discover new worlds, so to speak. And you saw a new group developing. And they began over a period of time to bring so much wealth to Europe that they became wealthier even than the nobility. And a feudal system that placed restrictions, limitations on the development of a whole new social force, a whole new mode of production that overturned feudalism. This is the basis for the overturn of feudalism and the development of what we characterize as democracy and a whole new social system. It is wealth that came from Africa and from other places in the world. And this, of course, is responsible for the transformation of conditions in Africa and the rest of the world, and why we live today in a world where at least half the people on this planet live off less than $2 a day, $2 US a day. And if you keep up with the newspaper, you know that the US dollar continues to decline in value, so $2 US is not much. And where you look in Africa, you find that Africans live off $1 a day on average, where in Europe, cows have an allocation of $2 a day. So that a cow in Europe has available to it more resources than an African in Africa. There's something wrong with that relationship, and it is a relationship that is reinforced and maintained at gunpoint. 1960s, all of us saw so much hope for our Africa. Sajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, being such a shining example who fought for united Africa. People like Patrice Lumumba, great patriots who loved Africa and died for Africa. And there were others, countless numbers of others. We had so much hope for our Africa. And then, of course, what we saw was a terrible aggression against Africa. We are in this Congress now to talk about the relationships between North and South, but these are relationships which are imposed at gunpoint. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown by the United States government. It created the coup. The United States government, France, and Belgium were actually engaged in a race to see who could kill Lumumba first. This is an objective reality. I mean, there's evidence of this today. I'm not telling anybody something that's a secret, right? Why? Because Nkrumah said that the wealth of Africa should belong to Africa and African people. And because Nkrumah understood that the colonial borders that had been created by imperialism locked us into poverty
and said that the only way Africa could survive and move into the future was through being united and liberated. And because Lumumba stood for the same thing, and people like Sobukwe in South Africa and others. This is what we are contending with. It is no accident. Africa did not volunteer for this. Africa brought, it is the place on earth. Even the most rabid, reactionary, frothing at the mouth, right-wing forces throughout Europe and North America have to admit today that human life itself originated in Africa, which tells us that Africa is not hostile to life. It is the place on earth that is naturally the friendliest to life itself. Was nobody from Manchester in England or Paris in France that went to Africa and created life? Life emerged in Africa. Civilization emerged in Africa. Great civilizations. So why is Africa poor today? I contend that there is a relationship between the poverty of Africa and the wealth of Europe and North America. And this relationship is tied to slavery, to colonialism, and to instruments of coercion that have been created in the wake of slavery and colonialism to keep Africa trapped in the place where it is today. Because Africa is trapped into a parasitic relationship with Europe and North America. And all of us know, we're in the university here, and I'm sure they teach us what parasitism is all about. That a parasite must necessarily have a host to live on. You can't convince a parasite to leave a host. You can't pray a parasite off a host. Parasites must have a host in order to live, to exist. So it seems to me, the questions that we are confronted with is, what is responsibility of Africa first, and African people? What must we do to change the reality that through most of Africa, we see African women who will work all day just to get enough food for that day? We see African children who walk miles to get water because there is no clean water in most of Africa. We see people who are trapped in the most miserable kind of poverty in a place that has so much wealth, even as they are sitting in a place where they see their resources, their wealth leaving in lorries and trucks, going to Europe on a daily basis. We talk about immigrants. It is so difficult today for Africans to travel anywhere, to come to Spain, to come to the United States from Africa, to come to Europe and Africa. You can't come. You're some kind of illegal. What we must tell them is, when we come to here, we are chasing our own resources, which have been taken from Africa and transformed. You may have forgotten where they come from, but I remember. And those of us, all of us, have this responsibility. You don't have to be an African to hate this relationship. It is so easy for Europeans to sympathize with impoverished African people, send $1 to help a poor, starving African child. It is so easy. But what we have to challenge is the relationship. You know the British story of Robin Hood, who robs from the rich to give to the poor. That's not what we are about. We're not looking to rob from the rich to give to the poor. We must assume the responsibility to change the world of rich and poor, so that those where all these resources are coming from also have a right to live. So this is my contention. My contention is that the governments whether in Africa, neo-colonial puppet governments, white power in blackface, most of them. Or the governments in Europe and North America, certainly not North America, will not do anything to change this relationship. But people can change this relationship. But in many instances, you have to be willing to go against what your government and what the corporations in your government recognize as their interests. Because as you know, George W. Bush and the one who came before him and before him and before him saw as what was in their natural interest oil that is under the sands of people who live in Saudi Arabia and other places like that. Coltan that comes from Congo is seen as being their national interest. Right now, the United States is creating this thing called AFRICOM, the Africa Command, where we will create even more U.S. troops in Africa to control Africa. Right now, in the Gulf of Guinea, new, increasing U.S. military intervention. Of course, it has nothing to do with oil that they have found there, and the growing contest they have for oil with China that is also oil hungry, right? We are told that they're doing this for our own good. Like when they first came and got us, to bring us to Christianity and civilization. We must say no. No to AFRICOM. No to this imperialist intervention. We must do this. The countries and the governments won't do this. And I want to finally say this. The primary project that I'm working on is called the African Socialist International, where we have as an objective of organizing African revolutionary organizations everywhere on earth where African people live. I speak passionately about Africa and as our Africa, not as some observer. We work in Southern Africa and South Africa right now. We work in Swaziland as well. We work in Kenya. We work in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Guinea-Conakry, under the worst kinds of circumstances under puppet governments that serve imperialism and not our own people. We work in Europe and particularly in England and throughout North America. And I'm sure that I have left something out, but our responsibility is to build the organization that Garvey and Nkrumah talked about. Africa will not be free. There is not going to be a free Ghana or a free Nigeria separate from the rest of Africa and African people. Africa must be free. Africa must be united in order to even have access to its own resources. We live in a world today where many Africans some Africans may even disagree with this. They say, oh, I'm not, I'm a Nigerian, I'm Sudan, I'm et cetera, et cetera. And so I have no relationship to the rest of Africa. But even as we are having these silly arguments, there are Europeans from France, from North America, from Germany, from England, from Spain, from all these other places who are sucking the blood of Africa. And so they act like Pan-Africanists, even as we run away from recognizing that our Africa must be united and we have to fight for all of Africa. That is what we have to do in order to be free, and African people everywhere. So that's our primary project, is to unite, to build a revolutionary organization with the understanding that the freedom of Africa is going to have to be taken. It's not going to be given to us. And that we have to forge relationships with other freedom-loving people all over the world in this process. That's how I know who is my friend when I hear an argument between Hugo Chavez and the King of Spain. We say, viva Hugo Chavez. el presidente, el comandante. That's how we know where we stand, because we stand on the side of the future. And the future belongs to the oppressed peoples of the world. And we also say this thing finally. There's an issue that's assuming increasing significance in the world today. It is this question called reparations, to repair the damage. And we have been involved in this struggle for reparations for many, many, many years now. In fact, our party contributed to making the reparations issue a popular issue, taking it out of back rooms and closets. In fact, when we first started talking about reparations, we were considered a lunatic fringe who would talk about reparations. But increasingly all over the world, this discussion is happening. And right now, we are involved in a project to develop a world tribunal, an international tribunal on reparations for African people. That will probably occur in what we call South Africa now. And we think South Africa is an ideal place to make this happen, because it is one of the places where there is so much illusion, where we are now told that there is a rainbow coalition, a rainbow nation, where all the people are happy after the release of Nelson Mandela and the ascension of the African National Congress to power. Of course, those are people who have not been there who say this. Those who have been there recognize that even today, in fact, when I was there in 2004 rather, I read a poll published by one of the South African newspapers that said in the 10 years at that time since the African National Congress had been to power, the African people had become 14% poorer, and the whites had become 19% richer. And in what they call South Africa today, you have an unemployment rate of more than 50%, 40% rather. And thousands of Africans who live in these shanty towns made of scraps, etc. And the people cannot see a future except for a handful of people who have been given tremendous resources in these economic scams that unites a sector of the African middle class with their imperialist overlords at the expense of the mass of African workers and poor people. And we think it's important to go to South Africa because there are still people in South Africa who are in prison who participated in the liberation struggle, even under the ANC government, because they refused to participate in the so-called Truth and Reconciliation process, where both the South African regime and its people who work for it to keep African people oppressed, and the people who fought against them are now to confess the crimes that they committed. So somehow, if you are a bank robber, you have to confess that you tried to rob a bank. And if you shot at the bank robber who was robbing the bank, you have to confess that you shot at the bank robber. So it equalizes both the actions of the oppressed and the oppressor. And so many people would not participate in this process. They are in prison in South Africa today. There are scores of them still locked up. And so we think it's going to be really important to be able to do this tribunal on reparations for African people, for Africans from around the world to come together, and among other things, to actually begin to quantify the amount of value that has been stolen from Africa and brought to Europe, because there are many Africans who live under the illusion that we are poor. But we who have been to Spain, who have been to the United States, who have been to Europe, we can say Africa is not poor. Look at what Africa has produced. All right? And so we want to come together and we can document, we can begin to quantify the amount of value that has been taken from Africa. We can begin to expose the audacity of a British government, of a US imperialism, and Europe altogether, for claiming that Mugabe is the poster child for criminal behavior because they began to take land from the squatters who stole the land in the first place. Where we can begin to talk about how Cecil Rhodes, who introduced the Maxim machine gun to what is now Zimbabwe, and on an afternoon would kill 5,000 Africans and then have champagne and tea afterwards, and how they brought mercenaries from England to whom they give thousands of acres of land for helping them to kill the Africans there to take the land. These are things that Africans need to understand and everybody else around the world needs to understand as a part of our demand for reparations. So, our dear friends, I've spoken for a long time, and my comrade here has been extremely patient. And so have you been extremely patient in listening to me. But I would like to extend my profound appreciation to all of you for coming, and I do hope that we can talk about this question of Africa, the conditions of existence in Africa, right, in a more meaningful way, because Africa does not need charity. Africa needs solidarity. Africa needs solidarity. So hopefully there's solidarity here. Africa, you know, we have so much work to do to liberate and unify our Africa and our people everywhere. I would like to leave you with a slogan that comes from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania during its revolutionary heyday. It is Zulu. I don't speak any language. I don't even speak English well. And there's a story behind that too. When we have enough time, we'll talk about that. But in Zulu, it is call and response. I say, Izwe letu. It means the land is ours. And you say, E Africa. You've identified which land is ours. And I say, E Africa. And if you're African, you say, Izwe letu. And if you're not African, you say, Izwe le nu, which means that the land is yours. If you want. I love that slogan. Can you work with me? Izwe letu.
E Africa.
E Africa.
Izwe letu.
Thank you so much, Uhuru.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Yeshitela, for your energy, for your provocation, for your, as I told you, brilliant speech. Thank you very much. You have told a very important thing, that people can change the relationship effectively. This is our time for people. We start our debate. You can make your questions in English, in French, or in Spanish. It's the same thing because our translators can translate. But our translators need to solidarity as Africa, non-charity. For this reason, please, quiet. Thank you very much. Who is the first? Please. We have microphone? Sorry? Here? In this side? We don't have microphone? Okay.
Yo primero voy a felicitarlos. Yo estaba encantado. Perfecto. Pero me ha faltado oír una cosa. Yo he quedado con las ganas de oír una cosa. Porque yo tengo una experiencia de 30 años en África. Y yo siempre, o sea, en el fondo, yo cuando digo algo, algunas charlas y tal, o sea, comparto absolutamente.
¿Hay micrófono?
Pero, ¿qué opináis de los dirigentes africanos? ¿Qué opináis de los gobiernos africanos?
A ver si podemos acercar a alguien que acerque el micrófono allí, porque es que él no está oyendo, ¿sabes? Just a minute. Are you listening? Are you listening?
Yeah, but there's no translation.
Ah, okay. Well, just a minute, please.
Okay.
Es que no ha oído bien y quizás no sé si podemos subir que acercar arriba. Eso es más práctico, sí. Disculpe, es que
Nada.
si no él no puede oír.
Sí. Sí. Yo comentaba,
No, I have, ¿no?
o sea, que me ha encantado su intervención, me ha encantado. Comparto prácticamente todo lo que ha dicho. Pero me ha faltado oírle algo al final, ¿no? Me ha faltado oírle qué responsabilidad tienen los actuales dirigentes, los gobiernos africanos. Porque desde que empiezan los movimientos independentistas en África, hoy día todos los gobiernos que hay son gobiernos de ciudadanos africanos. Y ellos tienen su responsabilidad, ¿no? Si no, podemos ver casos más concretos de la antigua Guinea española, la Guinea ecuatorial. ¿Cómo se permite esa expoliación del petróleo? ¿Cómo esas multinacionales norteamericanas están haciendo eso? ¿Qué dice el gobierno de Guinea? ¿Qué dicen los gobiernos africanos? ¿Qué dicen los gobiernos donde se les traen tantas riquezas? No sé, eso es lo que me gustaría oírle. Por lo demás, nada, encantado con lo que usted ha dicho y felicitarlo, ¿no? Lo comparto absolutamente. Pero me falta oírle a usted ese punto de vista de los gobiernos africanos. Gracias.
Thank you very much for that question. I did not speak that much about African governments. I did mention it in passing, particularly this thing that Kwame Nkrumah referred to as neo-colonialism, which is a new social arrangement based on an economic relationship that was imposed on Africa subsequent to so-called independence. And the fact is that there have been these flag independence, as they refer to often in Africa, where oftentimes former colonial masters will participate in ceremonies, sometimes even help to write the constitutions. They will give a new flag, and with great ceremony, they would ship out at 12:01 representing symbolically the beginning of a new era. But what is left out of view for most people is that the economy is still controlled by the same forces who were there before. That's why we said it is white power in blackface. And that at best the Africans become administrators of economic interests that's still held by the colonial powers. And when those Africans, should they ever dare to challenge that relationship, as did Nkrumah, you find forces like the United States government who worked to overthrow Nkrumah, Lumumba, who was killed by French, Belgium, and U.S. together, and other leaders of that nature. So what you have is this form of brutal manipulation that is imposed on Africa. And then you have in schools all over Europe and North America institutions that are designed to train so-called African leaders to become servile, malleable forces that will protect the interests of imperialism and the United States. And and that's the kind of relationship, and that's why they talk about the AFRICOM, particularly in an era of a growing crisis of imperialism. As oppressed peoples around the world increasingly struggle to take control of their resources, such as in the Middle East, it becomes absolutely necessary for armed force and naked armed force to become an aggressor. We have entered an era into an era of a war without end. Well, in fact, that's what Bush has defined it. This war against terrorism doesn't define an enemy. It appears to be anything that scares white people. But so this is the relationship that we're looking at. And yes, now you have these thugs who are in power in Guinea that could not stay there for 30 days without the support of the Spanish government or other imperialist powers. And the same government, for example, that claim they are invading
Iraq right now, uphold for democracy, responsible for imposing terrible dictatorship on masses of people throughout the world. That's the kind of relationship we live with. But I agree, Africans have a primary responsibility. Our responsibility ultimately as Africans is going to have to be to remove those governments, to remove them, because the fact is that the neocolonialism and the neocolonial borders serve only for the extraction of value, leaving Africa, going to Europe and to North America, and also for the purpose of reproducing the African neocolonial petty bourgeoisie as a social force. That's the only service that those borders have. They have to go. And ultimately, it's going to take a mass movement of African people on the ground, grassroots organizations on the ground, to overturn them because they're not willingly going to leave.
Alors, je pense que je vous viens de...
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie. Je voudrais poser quelques questions. Parce que je vous ai entendu dire...
Excusez-moi, voulez-vous parler plus fort?
Je vous ai entendu dire quelque part que vous travaillez en Afrique. Sur la liste des pays que vous avez énumérés, je n'ai entendu comme pays francophone que la Guinée. Qu'est-ce qui fait que vous travaillez seulement dans les pays africains mais anglophones? C'est la première question. La deuxième question, depuis quelque temps, on nous parle de réparation, et je voudrais savoir si un jour l'Europe acceptait ou les États-Unis acceptaient de réparer en ce qui concerne l'esclavage, à qui ils allaient verser l'argent. J'espère que ce n'est pas à nos gouvernements qui vont reverser l'argent. Donc il faudrait qu'on sache si on réparait cette faute, à qui on va verser ce montant-là. Je vous remercie. Je suis Seyna Boutal, présidente de l'association Femmes, Enfants, Environnement du Sénégal. Merci.
C'est bien.
Oh, splendid. Thank you so much for that question, because that is a real question, not only for Africans in Africa. I want to say two things about that. Not only for Africans in Africa,